Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Huntington's disease and Huntington's disease medications. Okay, right, so we are currently on our way to discussing the neuroanatomy of the basal ganglia. So we started off with this picture that I'm assuming everyone viewing is familiar with. We're seeing the left cerebral hemisphere from the left-hand side, and then we're seeing the brainstem structures peeping out from underneath, with the left side of the cerebellum visible here, and then the spinal cord below the bottom of the brainstem here. Okay, right, so the next picture I'm going to show is we're going to work our way up the brainstem. Okay, so what I'm going to do is take away the cerebral hemispheres. I'm going to take the left cerebral hemisphere away and the right cerebral hemisphere, which we can't see on this picture, but that's going to go as well. And we're now going to show other structures that are located in the middle of the cerebral hemispheres, which we can't see on this picture here. And we're going to show where they are relative to these structures which we're now familiar with, which are the bottom structures of the brainstem. So, we're effectively going to move up the brainstem and see what structures lie above this, okay, which we can't see on this picture because they're in the middle of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, right. So I'll draw this picture here. So here is the spinal cord, once again shown here. And then above the spinal cord we've then got the medulla. I'll bring this down a little bit here. Okay, then above the medulla what we've got is the pons. Okay, and now we've got the full pons. Previously we only had the lower portion of the pons. So I'll colour in the pons once again in blue. I'll colour in the medulla here in red. And I'll colour in the spinal cord below that in green here. Okay, then above the pons what you're going to have is at the midbrain. Okay, and from the side the midbrain doesn't look particularly interesting, it just looks like this, it looks like a box, but it's far more interesting when you see it from above, which we'll be looking at in a moment. Okay, so I'll colour in the midbrain in orange here. Okay, right. Now, the midbrain is the final piece then of the brainstem. Okay, so the three components of the brainstem together now are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So all of this is known as the brainstem. Okay, right, and all of the brainstem structures are right in the middle. Okay, so you only have one of each of those structures. You have one medulla, one pons, and one midbrain, and they're divided equally into a left-hand side and a right-hand side, okay, which are sitting on the two sides. Okay, right, now, when we move above the midbrain, we're now going to go over to having bilateral structures, okay? So we're going to now have the thalami. Now there are two thalami. There's one on each side. There is a left thalamus and there is a right thalamus, okay? So we are looking at the structure from the left-hand side here. So the thalamus that we're going to see is the left thalamus. So I'll colour in this thalamus in turquoise here. Okay, so this is the left thalamus, and it will be perched on top of the left-hand side of the midbrain, and this will all become clearer when we show it from above later on. Okay, but perched on top of the right-hand side of the midbrain, you'll then have the right thalamus, which we can't see on this picture because the right thalamus is hidden behind the left thalamus. Okay, but you do have two thalami, whereas you only had one of each of the brainstem structures. Okay, then, the final thing that I want to add on to this picture is the hypothalamus, which is sitting in front of the thalamus here, and also the midbrain. Okay, so from the left-hand side, the hypothalamus is going to look like this. Okay, with certain other structures associated with it. Okay, so let me outline what each of these little bits is. So firstly, we'll begin with this little process at the front here, which I've just coloured in yellow. Okay, this is not part of the hypothalamus. Okay, this is instead the optic chiasm. Okay, so this is where nerve fibres in the optic nerves are going to cross over to get to the optic tract on the contralateral side. Okay, so that's the optic chiasm. Okay, another important structure here that is not part of the hypothalamus is this structure here dangling down in pink, and this is the pituitary gland. and we've got both portions of the pituitary gland. We've got the anterior pituitary gland and then the posterior pituitary gland. So this is the anterior pituitary gland and this is the posterior pituitary gland. The rest of that structure then, which I'll colour in green, this is all hypothalamus. Okay, so here's the pituitary stalk dangling down to where the pituitary is, and then we've got these special portions of the hypothalamus back here, okay, known as the mammillary bodies. Now we can only see one of them. We can see the left mammillary body here, but there's another one on the right hand side which will be the right mammillary body. Okay, now, for such tiny, innocent little structures, they're actually incredibly important in memory. Okay, if you lose them, you get all sorts of problems with memory. Okay, so this is the hypothalamus here. Okay, right. So far we still have not seen a single portion of the basal ganglia. Okay, but in the next picture that I draw, I promise you we will see the first two portions of the basal ganglia. Okay, this was all just to put things in context. So the next picture that I'm going to draw is going to be a transverse section of the midbrain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut across, like here, near the top of the midbrain, and I'm going to look down at the transverse cross-section of the midbrain. Okay, right, so I'm looking at the midbrain from above, effectively. Okay, now, as I said, the midbrain has a much more interesting structure when you look at it from above than when you look at it from the side, like so. Okay, so let me now draw it from above. Okay, from above it looks like Mickey Mouse. Okay, now when I draw midbrains, they end up looking more like pigs than Mickey Mouse. But whenever you see it on an MRI scan, it's very, very distinctive because you really do see Mickey Mouse looking back at you. Okay, so here we go. And the reason it ends up looking like Mickey Mouse is because you have these two appendages coming off it up here which look like the ears of Mickey Mouse. Their real name is the cerebral peduncles. Okay, right, so let's put on some landmarks of the midbrain then. So the first landmark that I want to talk about is what's known as the periaqueductal grey. Okay, and this surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, so the midbrain actually has a tube running through it. Okay, known as the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, and if I show this on the other picture, it's going to be like so. You've got this tube running through the entire midbrain. Okay, and this tube is going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid, and it's going to be incontinuous with the third ventricle, which is going to be a great big space, a great chamber full of cerebrospinal fluid that we will come on to later, but I'll tell you now, it's between the thalami and it's also within the hypothalamus, but we'll come on to that more later. Okay, and it's also going to be continuous below with a ventricle that sits behind the pons and in front of the cerebellum, okay, in this sort of position here, known as the fourth ventricle. Okay, but we won't say anything more about the fourth ventricle. Right, then the portion surrounding the midbrain here, okay, the neural tissue surrounding the cerebral aqueduct, this is known as the periaqueductal grey, okay, or in full, the periaqueductal grey matter. And for short, the periaqueductal grey matter is often abbreviated as the PAG. Okay, so let's colour in the periaqueductal grey matter then in turquoise here. Okay, right, so that's one of the features of the midbrain. Okay, let's move on to another feature. These little projections that we've got coming off the back of the midbrain, these have a name. Okay, these are known as the superior colliculi. So you've got two of them. You've got a left superior colliculus and a right superior colliculus, and the plural is the superior colliculi. Okay, now I didn't show them on this picture, but I'll try and show them. Okay, so you're going to have little projections coming off the back of the midbrain. Okay, now you also have inferior colliculi. Okay, and those will be underneath the superior colliculi here. Okay, and again you're going to have two inferior colliculi, a left inferior colliculus and a right inferior colliculus. So overall on the back of the midbrain you have four colliculi, two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. We took a cross-section quite high up in the midbrain, and therefore we're only seeing the superior colliculi rather than the inferior colliculi. Okay, now some other features, and I'm just drawing what will actually make it look like Mickey Mouse, okay, are the red nuclei here. Okay, and they should ideally be the same size. So these are the red nuclei, or singular red nucleus. So this is the right red nucleus that I've actually put my arrow to. And I'll colour, of course, the red nuclei in red. They don't really appear red. Okay, so there they are. Right, then finally, the next landmark that I actually want to put on the midbrain is going to be the first part of the basal ganglia. In fact, more than that, we're actually going to see the first two parts of the basal ganglia. Right, so let's put them on then. So they're both parts of the substantia nigra. Okay, and again they're bilateral. Okay, and they're in the first parts of these appendages of the midbrain. Okay, so the whole area here is known as the left substantia nigra, and this area is known as the right substantia nigra. So this is the substantia nigra, and of course, as I've just said, you have two of them, a left substantia nigra and a right substantia nigra. Now, what does it mean? Substantia means substance, nigra means black. Okay, so it's the black substance. Now this really does look black when you see a section of the midbrain. You don't even have to stain it with anything. These areas do look really dark compared to the surrounding neural tissue. Now the reason for that is that they contain a dark staining pigment, okay, known as, well, not a dark pigment, not dark staining pigment, a dark pigment, full stop. Okay, known as neuromelanin, okay, to show its analogies to the melanin that's within melanocytes in the skin. Okay, right. Now, the substantia nigra is divided into two portions that have very, very different functions, in fact, completely different functions. Okay, the medial portion here, which I will highlight in green here, is known as the substantia nigra pars compacta. Okay, so these names get very long, but luckily we have a nice abbreviation for all of this. Okay, so this is going to be the substantia nigra pars compacta. Okay, and this is the first portion then of the basal ganglia that we are seeing. Okay, located within the midbrain. So this, for short, is abbreviated to SN for substantia nigra, and then PC for pars compacta. Okay, right. The other portion then of the substantia nigra on the lateral side, here in red, is then called the substantia nigra pars reticulata. Okay, so this is the substantia nigra, and I don't know why I've written substantia nigra out again. You've probably got the hang of how to spell that now. Pars reticulata. Okay, and for short, the substantia nigra pars reticulata is abbreviated to the SNPR for substantia nigra pars reticulata. We will use these abbreviations from now on. SNPR for the substantia nigra pars reticulata and the substantia nigra pars compacta, the SNPC. Okay, right, and they are both parts of the basal ganglia, and we will be seeing their function within the basal ganglia. Okay, now it's the same on the right hand side as well. You've got the substantia nigra pars compacta as the medial part, and then the substantia nigra pars reticulata as the lateral part. Okay, right, so that then is your midbrain, and we've seen two portions of the basal ganglia within the midbrain. Okay, right. Now what I want to show you is the next basal ganglia component, or the next basal ganglion nuclei. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is the subthalamic nuclei. And for this, what I'm going to do is show you another picture of the midbrain. So I'm going to draw a fresh picture of the midbrain. Now, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to look at the midbrain from the top. Now, really, it's going to look exactly the same as what we've drawn here, where we're viewing a transverse section that's very close to the top. Okay, so I'll draw the same thing. So, this is the midbrain then viewed from the top. I'm just going to draw it a little bit smaller this time. Okay, so here are the superior colliculi protruding from the back. Okay, here is the right cerebral peduncle here. Okay, like so. Right, I'm going to now only put the substantia nigras on. Okay, so here is the right substantia nigra and here is the left substantia nigra. Now, sitting above the substantia nigras of the midbrain are two nuclei called the subthalamic nuclei, which are little almond shapes. Okay, now these are underneath the thalami, so remember the thalami are sitting on top of the midbrain. Okay, but squashed in between the midbrain and the thalamus are the subthalamic nuclei, and they sit on top specifically of the substantia nigra. Okay, so here, this is the left subthalamic nucleus. Okay, and then you've got also the right subthalamic nucleus, and therefore overall there are two, the subthalamic nuclei, and for short they're abbreviated down to the STNs. Okay, so let me just move this up a little bit. So here we have them, and I'll colour them in vivid purple here. Okay, so they're sandwiched between the substantia nigras below and then the thalami above. Okay, right. So, they are another component of the basal ganglia. So now, so far, we've got three components of the basal ganglia. We've got the substantia nigra pars compacta, the substantia nigra pars reticulata, and the subthalamic nuclei. Okay, we now need the final components of the basal ganglia, and for this we're going to have to look at the thalami sitting on top of the midbrain. Now the thalami are not going to be part of the basal ganglia, they're going to be part of this circuit that we're going to discuss, which the basal ganglia are involved in, but in order to show you where the remaining portions of the basal ganglia are, we need to have a better understanding of the thalami. Okay, right. So again, I'm going to draw a picture of the midbrain here. Okay, and I've just realised, is this actually, have I left enough space here? I'm going to go ahead with it. Okay, I'll draw everything small. So here is the midbrain here. Okay, here is the right cerebral peduncle and then the left cerebral peduncle. And then now what I'm going to show is the thalami sitting on top of the midbrain. Okay, so here is the left thalamus here. And then on top of the right side of the midbrain, you're going to have the right thalamus. Okay, so let's colour these in. So here is the left thalamus, now highlighted in turquoise here. Okay, and we will study the structure of the thalami in a little bit more detail later on. We'll need to in order to discuss this circuit. Okay, so here are the two thalami now viewed from above, which is a little bit more illuminating than this picture from the left-hand side. So previously, when we were viewing this from the left-hand side, all we were seeing is this boring aspect of the midbrain, which was just this aspect here. Okay, and then just this aspect of the left thalamus here. Okay, but from above you can see the true nature of this. Okay, and you'll notice that you have this space in between the two thalami here. This is the third ventricle, and this is going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid. So this is the third ventricle, and this is going to be drained by the cerebral aqueduct, which is going to be here. Okay, so that's how all of that works, and we'll talk a bit more about the third ventricle later on when I add on the hypothalamus onto this picture, but I'm not going to do that quite yet. Okay, right, so now what I want to show you is structures that are sitting lateral to the two thalami. So if we were to draw them on this picture, which we will do in a moment, okay, they would be sitting in front of the thalami. Okay, so at least the left one would, if we're viewing from the left-hand side. So we have got structures that are sitting alongside the two thalami here. Now I've written third ventricle where I'd want to draw it for the right-hand side, so I'm only going to show it from the left-hand side, but it would be bilateral. You've got these two structures sitting either side of the thalami. Okay, right. So let me start off by drawing the lenticular nucleus. Okay, and the reason it's called the lenticular nucleus is because it looks like a lens. Okay, so this entire thing that I'm drawing now is called the lenticular nucleus. Now the lenticular nucleus is split into three separate portions. Okay, initially we'll divide it into two portions, and then we'll divide this inner portion into another two portions. Okay, so firstly, this outer portion that is most lateral, okay, this is known as the putamen. Okay, of the lenticular nucleus. So all three portions here are going to be known as the lenticular nucleus. The entire thing that looks like the lens here is the lenticular nucleus. Now we're splitting it up into more pieces. And the outermost portion here in orange, this is the putamen. Okay, right. Then this more medial portion here, this is known as the globus pallidus. Okay, and I want to make sure I spell pallidus correctly. It's double L. Okay, right. So you can further divide the globus pallidus into two separate portions: an external globus pallidus that is more lateral, and an internal globus pallidus that's more internal, more medial. Okay, so this portion here, which I'll highlight in red here, this is the external globus pallidus, and for short, the external globus pallidus is abbreviated down to the GPE. So GP for globus pallidus, and then E for external. Okay, I think literally it stands for globus pallidus external segment. Okay, but we will refer to it as the external globus pallidus. Okay, right. Then the other portion, which I'll now highlight in blue here. Okay, the medial portion, this is then called the internal globus pallidus, and for short, the internal globus pallidus is abbreviated to the GPI. Okay, again standing for the globus pallidus internal segment. Okay, so this is the internal globus pallidus. Okay, right, now all three portions there are part of the basal ganglia. We are going to talk about all of these in this motor circuit that we're going to see. So far, the portions of the basal ganglia that we have seen are the substantia nigra pars compacta up here, the substantia nigra pars reticulata, the subthalamic nuclei, okay, and now we've seen the two portions of the globus pallidus, which are going to have very different functions, so it's important to distinguish between those two, the internal globus pallidus and the external globus pallidus. And then we've seen the putamen. Now the putamen is going to be part of a larger structure known as the dorsal striatum, which was this initial portion that we said was going to degenerate hugely in Huntington's disease. It is really striking when you see the brain of someone who has been suffering from Huntington's disease. The dorsal striatum has gone. Okay, that's the most striking feature of a Huntington's disease brain. Okay, right. So I want to now describe the other portion then of the dorsal striatum, because the putamen's only part of the dorsal striatum. Okay, now to see then the other portion of the dorsal striatum, we're going to have to look at this picture from another angle. Okay, so we're going to go back to looking at it from this angle here. We're going to go back to looking at it from the left-hand side. Okay, right. So I will draw this here, I think. So we'll start by drawing the thalamus again from the left-hand side here. So this is the thalamus, the left thalamus. Now, sitting in front of the thalamus now, or rather to the side of the thalamus, but because of the angle we're looking at, it is in front, we can now see the putamen, okay, which is the outermost portion of the lenticular nucleus. So this is all the putamen. Okay, now I can now put on the other portion of the dorsal striatum, okay, which is the caudate nucleus. Now the caudate nucleus has this fantastic, great curved structure, okay, like so. Okay, so I'll colour the caudate nucleus in purple. So it loops around in this fantastic way. Okay, it loops above the putamen and it loops down below the putamen, okay, and runs along like so. Okay, so this entire thing then is called the caudate nucleus, and I think I'll colour in the middle as well. Okay, so all of this is the caudate nucleus, and together the caudate nucleus plus the putamen are called the dorsal striatum. So this is the caudate nucleus, and the two of them together are then called the dorsal striatum. Now, the other piece of terminology I want to define for you is what is meant then by the entire striatum. So if someone says striatum, what does that mean? If this is the dorsal striatum, then what is the entire striatum? Well, to make the entire striatum, you need to add one more piece onto this. Okay, there's one piece missing if you want to draw the entire striatum, and it's this obvious little hole that you've got here. Okay, there's a bit missing here, and this is what's known as the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so I'll colour this in green here. So this little portion here, this is the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so the entire striatum consists then of the putamen, the nucleus accumbens, and the caudate nucleus here. That's what is meant when someone says the whole striatum. And if they're really being full, they will call this the corpus striatum, but everyone just calls it the striatum. Okay, right. Now, the dorsal striatum then just means the caudate nucleus along with the putamen. The ventral striatum, if you ever hear anyone talking about the ventral striatum, this means the nucleus accumbens, just the nucleus accumbens. It's another name for the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so this is the ventral striatum. These two portions are the dorsal striatum. In Huntington's disease, the caudate nucleus and the putamen are going to degenerate. They're the dorsal striatum. The nucleus accumbens is actually spared. It doesn't degenerate as bad as the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Now, the nucleus accumbens and the dorsal striatum have very different functions, so that's why we distinguish between the dorsal striatum and the ventral striatum. The dorsal striatum is part of the basal ganglia, and is part of a very important motor circuit. The nucleus accumbens is involved in motivation and the brain's natural reward system. Okay, so its function is very different from the dorsal striatum. Okay, right, so now let's just try and show the caudate nucleus on this other picture that we've shown here where we're viewing from above. Okay, so if I draw the caudate nucleus on here, it's difficult because really when we view from above all we'd see is this top lump here, but I'll try and show it curving around. Okay, so it's going to curve over the rest of the lenticular nucleus and it's going to curve underneath here. Okay, like so. So all of that's going to be the caudate nucleus. So if I now highlight it up in vivid purple to make it stand out, here is the caudate nucleus. Okay, all of this. Okay, so it goes right over the lenticular nucleus and then curves back under. And of course you're going to have this on both sides. This is the left structure here, but you're also going to have the right structure over here, and it will be bilaterally symmetrical. Okay, right. So now what we have done is we've discussed all of the structures of the basal ganglia. Okay, the basal ganglia then, in full, consist of the two portions of the substantia nigra, the substantia nigra pars compacta and the substantia nigra pars reticulata. They also consist of the subthalamic nuclei. The two portions of the globus pallidus are also there, the internal globus pallidus and the external globus pallidus. And then finally, you've also got the dorsal striatum consisting of the putamen and the caudate nucleus. Okay, right, we're not quite finished with the neuroanatomy. In the next video, what I want to show you is the nigrostriatal tract, which delivers dopaminergic fibers from the substantia nigra pars compacta into the dorsal striatum. Okay, and then what we can move on to is the function of the basal ganglia.